Integrated climate and biodiversity outcomes through the Global Stocktake. Not good? Okay. Trying. Yeah, okay, this is much better, sorry. Okay, I was just saying hi. So thanks again for joining this side event. My name is Catalina Gonda, and I'm Climate Policy Co-Coordinator at FARN, and I'm also the co-chair of Climate Action Network's Ecosystems Working Group. And I'm joined here by a great panel of people and experts. I have Marine Puget, Virginia Young, and Souparna Lahri. So Marine is working for CAN France as advisor for global climate governance, and she's also co-chairing the work on the global stocktake for CAN International members. Virginia is contributing to Griffith University's primary forest research program through the Australian Rainforest Conservation Society. And Souparna is climate and biodiversity policy advisor at the Global Forest Coalition. And he's also the lead for the working group on Article 6 on the Climate, Land, Ambitions and Rights Alliance. So the idea is to have this a panel of presentations just to kickstart hopefully a good conversation and exchange between you and the panelists. And I also encourage you to have also an informal discussion if you want to ask each other questions. So the idea is to keep it as informal as possible. But before we jump into their presentations and reflections, I would just like to probably frame the discussion on the side event, just to give a little bit of context on why we are addressing this issue today. So we are already aware that we're facing multiple intersectional global challenges. And in fact, environmental risks, and in particular climate change and biodiversity loss, dominate the World Economic Forum's lists for most impactful and most likely global risks for the next decade. But we know clearly that these environmental issues are not just environmental issues. These are crises that are displacing and putting the rights and lives of millions of people at risk over all the world. They are already causing irreversible economic and non-economic losses and damages in all regions. And they're also accentuating inequalities and marginalization of the most vulnerable sectors of society. So, stepping up to these colossal challenges requires us to adopt a holistic, inclusive, and system-based approach. And in fact, the IPCC and IPBES made it very clear in their recent co-sponsored workshop report that we can only succeed in reversing the climate and biodiversity loss emergencies through an integrated and ambitious response. So at the multilateral level, this should encourage more synergies and integration between the work being undertaken by countries under the UNFCCC and the CBD. However, this urge to integrate this climate and biodiversity approaches has not yet fully translated into climate and biodiversity governance, and current strategies to address both challenges remain very siloed. So in particular in the UNFCCC, there are a number of issues that lead to negative outcomes for climate, for natural ecosystems, and also human rights, including, above many, the way that carbon for natural ecosystems is accounted for, how forests are defined, and also the lack of recognition of the role of oceans in this whole process. So it's also, in addition to these challenges, it's also quite concerning how some of the decarbonization pathways and approaches that are being promoted in line with the 1.5 goal, pose severe threats for biodiversity, and in particular those that bank on very large-scale land-based removals and bioenergy. So these approaches in turn would severely compromise our ability to stabilize the climate and also enhance the resilience and adaptive capacity of societies and ecosystems. So protecting, restoring, improving management of natural ecosystems, in addition to and not instead of the phase out of fossil fuels, is the safest way to reach the 1.5 goal and net zero emissions by 2050, while at the same time ensuring nature conservation now and throughout the coming decades. But this can only be achieved through measures that involve, and above all, directly and substantially benefit local indigenous and peasant communities. Promisingly, the inclusion of climate biodiversity linkages in the Chile and Madrid Time for Action decision and the most recent Glasgow Pact manifests the growing importance that various parties are giving to linking both agendas. But the question is, how can we make these high-level political statements and signals truly operational, and how we can translate this into current and potentially future UNFCCC work streams and processes? So, well, this is what we would like to discuss today, with a particular focus on the current opportunities around the first Global Stocktake that launched here, the process that launched here at the SB 56, and also the discussions to operationalize the non-market mechanism under Article 6.8. So with just this brief introduction, I would like to invite first Marine Pouget to share with us CAN's views on this first Global Stocktake process and how it could help address these gaps, the existing gaps for reaching the Paris Agreement goals, and in particular, this gap on climate and biodiversity integration. So I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Catalina, and hi, everyone. As it was mentioned, I'm working for the Climate Action Network France, but I'm also coordinating our activities in the network on the Global Stocktake, also with other constituencies. And I'm very happy to be with you today to link a bit between GST, climate, biodiversity. Maybe first to be sure that we are all on the same page, the Global Stocktake is the evaluation mechanism of the Paris Agreement, and it should happen every 5 years in the middle of an NDC cycle. So as you know, we are currently in the 2020-2025 cycle, and we have the first Global Stocktake happening in 2023, so it means next year at the COP. And it will happen again in 2028 in the middle of 2025-2030 NDC cycle. So this is really a process coming at the middle to demonstrate to parties where we are and also where we need to be in the next NDC phases and where are the gaps. I'm coming to that a bit later. So there are 4 pillars in the Global Stocktake: mitigation, adaptation, finance and means of support, and cross-cutting issues. Cross-cutting issues, it's extremely large. You have loss and damage that is between the adaptation and the cross-cutting issue pillar, but you have also human rights and indigenous people's rights. Every item is coming under the ACE program, and you have also a question on ecosystems. On the process, it was launched at the COP28, but it started actually really yesterday with an open plenary. Maybe some of you were there. And today we have the roundtables beginning. So the roundtables are more technical dialogues happening around mitigation, adaptation, and finance. So it's really a process that is starting right now. Now, as I said, the aim of the GST is actually really raising ambition for the next NDC phase. And it's not only about gaps, it's also about it has a looking forward approach, because we know the gaps, most of us, right? So now it's the question is, how do we fill out these gaps, and how parties could send 2 years later NDCs providing solutions. And because this is about ambition, it means it's about staying on track with 1.5, and it means saving lives, livelihoods, but also ecosystems. It's assessing the entire content, actually, or at least trying, of the Paris Agreement. And that's where ecosystems are coming in. So there are 4 proposition we would made as CAN on how ecosystems can be better embedded in the GST process. For the moment, as I said, there is one question on how parties plan to protect their ecosystems. It's a very large question in the cross-cutting issue, and there is also one question on the use of carbon sinks in the mitigation pillar. So it's actually already in these two components of the global stocktake, but of course we will try to raise them also in the adaptation one and the finance one. So now, the 4 propositions. So we think that the GST is really an opportunity to assess progress on the implementation of the Paris Agreement ecosystems provisions. So the aim is also to identify the risk, the damages, and the perverse incentives for biodiversity and natural ecosystems associated with current mitigation efforts and measures. So it's not only about saying if parties are using carbon sinks in their mitigation measures, but how and what are maybe potential risks or even already risks that were assessed on the ground by the people most of the time living around these ecosystems. Yeah, so that's the first proposition we would have, and we think it's a very important one. The second one is we have the impression that for the moment the GST proposals and guiding questions that are asked to parties are not really detailed enough to assess the progress in implementing the Article 5 of the Paris Agreement. So we think it should be mentioned. It should be much better included. So this is an article that should have maybe its own questions and trying to really be able to understand how parties are working on the conservation of use of carbon and use of carbon sinks. So we would also like to see a reference to that very particular article there. 2 last points, the 2 last ones. We think it is crucial that the GST assess the adequacy, the loopholes, and the perverse incentives coming actually from the accounting and rules of the LULUCF sector. And we have a lot of suggestions on how to improve these accounting systems, and it's coming after me. There are already a lot of expertise next to me, so I will let Virginia go on this. But we have very concrete solutions that should be in the GST as new tools, or let's say adapted tools on the accounting, so that we are sure that we can fully capture what's happening in the LULUCF sector, which is missing yet. And the last point is the GST must assess the extent to which parties are aligning climate and biodiversity, and also how the parties are, which knowledge parties are using, what are the policy gaps, what are the people that are involved in this in these policies. And I want to flag a last point that we think it's crucial. When we are assessing the protection of ecosystems, it means also to assess if the parties are doing this by respecting local communities and indigenous people, rights, and if their knowledge is integrated, and also what are the roles that they are playing in this policy making. We can't assess, and we can't also give solutions on biodiversity protection if we don't include these people. So we hope that the GST is not only about greenhouse gas emissions that are, let's say, compensated by nature, but we hope that the GST is bringing also very much of this human rights and indigenous people rights perspective in there. I want to finish on the last point. That is not really it's not part of the 4 pillars we are proposing as CAN, but it's more a reflection to continue the conversation after. I'm not an expert on the CBD, but I'm wondering if the GST is not a possibility to better connect the 2 conventions. We know that the 2 of them are going in parallel, and maybe there could be a way to better coordinate. Maybe we could imagine that the global stocktake is also part of any assessment process that is already existing in the CBD. Maybe there is a link there, or maybe there is already some assessment mechanism inside the CBD that could be well connected with the GST. So I don't know exactly how this worked, but happy to hear your thoughts just after. I hope that was helpful to enter the discussion, and I'm giving back the floor to you, Kata.
Thanks a lot, Maureen. And I'm sure Virginia would love to speak to that last point you made. So I'll leave it to her later. But yeah, thank you so much, Maureen, for summarizing that in a very comprehensive and concise way. So yeah, now I would like to go over to Virginia to speak more specifically about this issue on accounting and how the Global Stocktake could really improve and provide recommendations to really overcome this challenges that we have currently with the accounting rules that are not fit for purpose to really assess what's going on in the land sector in terms of emissions. So yeah, I'll give it to you, Rich.
Thanks, Catalina. And I'm just so everyone knows, I'm actually using part of a presentation from Dr. Heather Keith at Griffith University, who I had hoped would be able to present virtually, but sadly, as we only got one place registered for the Substa, she can't present. So I'm taking some elements of her work to demonstrate a new ecosystem accounting framework that I think could be very helpful as a bridge between the conventions and as an additional tool to use within the UNFCCC. And the reason for that is that part of the research that Griffith University has been doing is looking at the international policy barriers to protecting primary forests, to supporting the rights and livelihoods of Indigenous communities who are engaged in ecosystem protection, actually a mapping exercise as well of the condition of the world's forests. And what's become really critically clear is that the condition of all natural ecosystems really matters for their long-term carbon storage. And that's a kind of missing part of the story in the UNFCCC. We've only ever thought of biodiversity as a kind of a co-benefit. Nice if you can get it, but don't worry too much. It's really all about the carbon. Now, what's very clear is that the closer that composition, natural patterns, abundance, structure of biodiversity is to their natural state, the more stable and resilient those systems are, and therefore the more secure their carbon storage, the less likely they are to be adversely impacted, at least under current climate conditions, to drought and fire in particular. And you can see that now through the mapping project that Griffith University has undertaken, the 2018-2019 fires. In Brazil, the fires stopped when they hit intact primary forest. Where you see the fire spreading is along logging roads and down snig tracks and in the recently cleared agricultural lands. So there's some powerful learning, I think, that's coming out of both the some of the work that IPBES has been doing, some of the work that various research projects have been doing on how the functional role, if you like, of biodiversity in underpinning the integrity of ecosystems and thus its relevance to long-term carbon storage. So when the university started looking at current ways of assessing carbon in land and ecosystems, we found, and many of you here will be aware of the sort of the weaknesses in the LULUCF rules, but we rapidly came to the conclusion that the current approach, at least alone, is not fit for purpose. You can't easily see the differences in condition and why that matters for the longevity of carbon storage, and the success even of your restoration action depends really on how ecologically based it is. So some of the slides that I'm going to show, as I say, are from Dr. Heather Keith's PowerPoint presentation given for another purpose, which was really to demonstrate that you can't really deliver on the promise of nature-based solutions unless you change your thinking about carbon accounting. And I'm not really sure how much detail to go into into a forum like this. What slide are you on, Kata? No, move on. That's, again, because that's the purpose. Yes, stay on that one for just a little while. So, in particular, what's become apparent is that there's been the framework that's been set up by the UNFCCC to date has actually encouraged planting new forests at the expense almost of protecting what we've got. That's one significantly perverse outcome, particularly if it leads to the destruction of primary or old-growth forests. The failure to actually see the opportunity cost, if you like, from allowing existing natural forests to grow old comes about because of the way in which baselines have been determined, and I'll come to a little slide on that a bit later. And there are a whole lot of issues around net accounting and really reducing the transparency that you need to have properly informed decisions. If you net out, say, all your harvest emissions in a given year through a much larger forest estate, you never really see the cost of those emissions or the potential benefit where you've got the option of not doing them, which some countries do, of allowing forests to continue growing rather than keeping on cutting them down. And the benefits of primary forests are never really seen. So, and they relate to things like the forest reference levels. Move on again past where are we? No, on to another slide. We're to the, yeah, that one probably. So the interesting thing is there have been lots of complaints about treating biogenic carbon and geocarbon as fungible because, strictly speaking, they don't operate in the same way. And that's led to a focus, if you like, on annual fluxes and ignoring the value of the carbon stocks in landscapes, which is really their main value. What are the carbon stocks and how stable are they? What is their longevity? They are the questions that are never really asked. And that's because we've focused in accounting on annual fluxes because that suits fungibility with fossil fuels. Because, you dig up fossil fuels, you stick them straight into the atmosphere. So people are looking, because the two sectors have been treated as fungible, that creates a blind spot. But nor too should there really be fungibility between different types of natural ecosystems in different kinds of condition. And the example given here is of some old-growth forest, not a particularly good photo really of a semi-natural ecosystem and some monoculture, a monoculture of trees. But the point being made is it's very clear now that there are considerable differences between the stability, longevity and resilience of each of these systems. So in a natural, largely undisturbed forest, you've got a large carbon reservoir in good condition and a very low risk of loss. And even in the terrible fires in Australia in 2019, 2020, older forests acted again as, they didn't completely act as barriers to fire as they normally would, but fire intensity and severity dropped and the damage was far less than in young regrowth forests, which are now showing up in all the science as being far more susceptible to fire, and they increase both fire severity and risk, and that's in the 10 to 30 year age class. This has profound implications for what we do with our forests moving forward. So that in a semi-natural forest ecosystem, it's moderate risk and moderate condition, and in plantations, it's actually very low condition and very high risk. They're far more susceptible to pests, disease, drought and fire. Next slide, Kat, I think. No, we'll skip that one. We'll go, oh, well, no, sorry, that's the baseline issue. And so there was a move in to change the way in which forest reference levels were dealt with in Europe a couple of years ago, and that's improved things somewhat. But basically, setting a reference level based on projections of the future, based on the past, has led to all sorts of perverse outcomes that Giacomo Grassi and others have identified in accounting, and that still sit there in many countries around the world. So you never really see the potential or the scale of the loss. What could be avoided if you didn't conduct those activities? We'll move on again. I'm going to take too long on all of this. It's really terribly technical. The point that I'm basically coming to is that there is a way of not just compensating for some of these weaknesses, but filling a key gap. And that's come about because of some work that the UN Statistical Division has done, developing a new environmental and economic accounting framework for ecosystems. Now, the UN SEA was only released last year, and there is still some work going on through various working groups, including a forest working group. But it's designed to be picked up in national accounts. So in the economic accounts that countries develop, most countries refer to the standards that are set by the UN Statistical Division. So this will become a new global standard for ecosystem accounting, and it has several very useful features in that it enables you to account for both stocks and flows. All land and ecosystems can be spatially referenced, and so it's a comprehensive. It doesn't distinguish between managed and unmanaged lands as we do in LULUCF and the AFOLU sector. It's all land is included and spatially referenced. The stocks can be disaggregated into different categories. Most importantly, and this is a key difference, is that the integrity or quality or condition of ecosystems, and thus the stability of their carbon reservoirs, can be assessed. It'll take into account all carbon pools within ecosystems, including above and below ground biomass, dead biomass and soil carbon, which none of the accounting measures currently do in LULUCF. And it reports on gross flows, both gains and losses. And in the interests of transparency, that is really important if you're going to make informed management decisions about what you might be able to change. And the reference level, this is the other really spectacularly important difference, is the natural reference level. It's a reference level that represents an ecosystem of high integrity. And the physical measure of carbon stocks and flows within the ecosystems can be linked to... I've done it to myself now. What's happened here? Lost it. Can be linked to the economic system through tenure, land ownership, and valuation of the ecosystem services and the sectors that benefit from different ecosystem services. So you can apply it specifically to carbon or all ecosystem services. I'm not going to go through that slide. So this next one, that's simply to make the point that the reference level, which the SEA does, would include the natural carbon carrying capacity. So it would look at both the current carbon stock, the carbon carrying capacity, i.e. what's its ecological potential, and the carbon retention potential if you allowed ecosystems to recover or you fostered recovery. So that's a layer of additional information that's incredibly useful for management decisions. Next slide. This is the definition of ecosystem integrity in the UNCEA. So it's defined as the system's capacity to maintain composition, structure and function over time, using processes and elements characteristic for its ecoregion and within a natural range of variability. The system has the capacity for self-organisation, regeneration and adaptation by maintaining a diversity of organisms and their interrelationships to allow evolutionary processes for the ecosystem to persist over time at the landscape level. Ecosystem integrity encompasses the continuity and full character of a complex system. Now, if you think about how different that is to the definition of a forest in the UNFCCC, which is a stem-based per hectare definition with no ecological content whatsoever. So that is an amazingly important difference. Next slide. Oh no, we'll move on from there. This is just an example of stocks and flows in different management scenarios. We'll move on past that one. Go to that one. Yes, thank you. So there are several options for how to integrate UNCEA. One would be to actually change the accounting process in the UNFCCC. Another would be to simply add it in as a new tool, as a new information system to inform state parties, to give a much better information base to guide the sort of management decisions that are being made. Now, in an ideal world, you would separate biocarbon and geocarbon, and that's just based on the science. I don't think anyone here, I don't necessarily expect anyone here to take up that challenge, but it would be scientifically much more robust if we had separate targets for biocarbon and geocarbon. So some of this is about the reasons why we shouldn't be offsetting between fossil fuel combustion with removals by tree planting, and it's just, again, the issues around fungibility keep coming back to haunt us everywhere in this system. It is essential to have an information system or accounting framework that actually can integrate biodiversity and carbon, and that is what the CEA does. It is, in that sense, it's potentially a huge bridge between the conventions. The CBD is already proposing to use the CEA as an indicator of ecosystem condition. Now, it would be terrific if the UNFCCC actually picked that up. It's just a no-brainer of a linkage. It could also inform how you prioritise in nature-based solutions. Given that a large number of people are determined to use the term, it's then important to have some way of ensuring that you actually do deliver through NBS for both climate and biodiversity. So this system could help you do that. And it provides an important, really improved information base for NDCs, for making actions and targets more transparent and increasing the cumulative long-term carbon storage in the biosphere. So that it's a really important tool that can be accessible to everybody. And it also, I think, would create greater certainty for investment in sustainable livelihoods, and particularly climate-resilient livelihoods, which is what we really need to be thinking about in the future. Next slide, I think, is the final slide, Catalina. The prioritisation that logically emerges, and there's a separate peer-reviewed paper on applying the ecosystem CEA approach to forests and carbon, as well as a summary for policymakers that I can make available to anyone that's interested. But a clear prioritisation emerges. You protect your most stable, long-lived carbon reservoirs in both fossil fuels and stable ecosystems, such as primary forest. You want to keep both of them in the ground. And you restore carbon stocks in ecosystems through ecological restoration and encourage the recovery of secondary natural forests. That actually gives you a far greater both carbon return and increased stability and longevity than planting new trees. It's actually far more cost-effective pathway. Now, you might still need to plant trees for wood but you know, there really is a very purpose-planted trees supply the vast bulk of the world's wood supply. Now, not all of that is in any sort of robust ecological condition, so there's a whole other story about improvements to forest management and what that might look like. And most importantly, you need to manage carbon dynamics at timescales relevant for climate change mitigation, i.e. 2030 and 2050. You don't want to create a carbon debt for decades by using wood to substitute for other products such as bioenergy. And the failure to see the carbon debt associated with bioenergy is another profound failing, and that's because we allow parties to offset the emissions in the patches that are logged each year by the entire forest production estate, much of which will never be logged but is still sequestering carbon. And it's a delusion really that you've got something that is sustainable. The reality is that if you're logging, 30, 40, 50-year-old forests to produce bioenergy, that is the carbon, that is how long it would take to replace that carbon. It's not some instantaneous thing that's happening like magic in the existing forest estate. The IPCC itself drew attention to this, that you would need to be increasing your forest somewhere else to offset it. You can't do everything, you can't manage that debt from logging and then burning out of the same patch of forest and assume that it's carbon neutral. So that's a very brief introduction to the UNCEA and what it could potentially bring to this space. As I said, there's a peer-reviewed paper published in January last year, and then a summary for public policymakers that didn't ever make it into this forum because no one could travel from Australia, or wanted to even at the end of last year. So I'd be happy to share those with people. It's relevant to both the global stocktake because the integrity and stability of ecosystems is actually critical for determining what mitigation capacity there is in land, forests and ecosystems. And it's relevant also, I think, to 6.8, but I think because that's the one obvious mechanism we already have for delivering holistic outcomes under the Paris Agreement. But I won't take up any more time, Catalina, and sorry if that was a very patchy presentation.
No, thank you so much, Virginia, doing a great job.
Sorry
and
about that.
in like translating this highly technical complex issue into like a story that it's easy to follow, because I know people when you speak about accounting run away. So I think it's a great job you're doing like in delivering these types of presentations. So thanks again. And yes, I will now turn to Souparna, diverging a bit from the global stocktake. So just to also give a bit of introduction on this topic. Adoption of guidance on Article 6.8 was achieved at COP26. And this is an article that addresses non-market international cooperation among governments. This article provides opportunities to operationalize and strengthen current mechanisms and provisions in the UNFCCC, and many of which relate to the climate and biodiversity nexus, and also on improving opportunities for indigenous peoples and local communities and as agents of climate action. So I think I'll leave it at that and let Souparna speak, because he's the expert on this. So I'll just put your presentation.
Everybody has now become an expert. That's not the point anyway. Yes. Someone whom I respect as a teacher is sitting just next to me, and I accept that some of that also goes still to top of my head. But and Virginia today has profusely used the word nature-based solutions, and I'm not very courageous enough to use the word nature-based solutions at this point of time, because those who are destroying nature are saying that the very solution lies in that nature. So that it's like very contradictory to me. And the second aspect, before I go into the structures and, when you talk of seeking real synergy and real solutions between two systems, that also UN systems, and to issues of climate change and biodiversity loss, you need to see how the structures behave at this point of time, where is the kind of synergy you can find, and how they interact. Is that during the last phase of negotiations in Geneva, there was at some point of time, one or two parties were talking of reference level. Now, in terms of CBD, biodiversity, there is no baseline, there is no reference level still now. So what will be the baseline? What will be the reference level? Is it 1992 or 1870 or something else? So this is where we are. And in terms of UNFCCC and CBD, they follow in quite a different way. Like in CBD, you mostly find a 10-year strategic plan, and you have milestones, goals, milestones, and targets to achieve. And still, CBD is something which is binding on the parties, fortunately, not like what we have in Paris Agreement. And still, you have a national biodiversity state action plan, which is very close to NDCs, but it's binding. You have a national reporting, which is still binding. And all the convention decisions by the COP are still binding on parties. So we don't have to, every time when we talk of goals, milestones, and targets, put those things like we have in the Paris Agreement, because it's whatever has been achieved before in terms of CBD negotiations and decision text of the COP are still binding. And so if you talk of the rights of the indigenous people, their traditional wisdom, their traditional knowledge, it's part of the binding convention, one of the articles of the convention, which is Article 8J. So that way, if you talk of the gender plan of action, which is adopted, it's still binding. And within this structure, when this whole issue of synergy between climate change and biodiversity loss comes in, I can hear the concern from the civil society following CBD and the CBD Alliance is that we don't want something like a Paris Agreement to be at this point of time, because we are negotiating something which is global biodiversity framework, and God forbid we don't arrive at something like a Paris Agreement. And we don't want climate change, mitigation centric things being coming into the biodiversity thing, because it means nothing to us. So you can see that one of the targets, it starts with climate change being the drivers of biodiversity. And that is the concept which is coming in now. But we say the drivers of forest loss and biodiversity loss. And so here, if you think of synergy, there are concerns and there are problems. And there are both, as Virginia pointed out, some of the positive sides if we can really fight for the real synergy. So how does this synergy comes in? I think if you go to the Chile Madrid time for action, which Virginia has actually mentioned, and it was a COP25 decision, these two lines underlines the essential contribution of nature to addressing climate change and its impacts, and the need to address biodiversity loss and climate change in an integrated manner. Recognizing this, when you go to the Glasgow Pact, CMA 3, Para 38, everything looks fine, emphasizing the importance of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature and ecosystems. Everything looks fine. But I have already conveyed my concern that if you go to the actual text, these paragraphs are put under mitigation. And you're talking of this paragraph serving as a synergy between UNFCCC, CBD, or climate change and biodiversity issues. And here lies the concern. So if you see now the draft global biodiversity framework, which is being negotiated, and the next phase of negotiation is going to start next week, next to next week, 21st, how is this synergy comes in a different way, in the back door, through little terms being inserted into the text. And what is that? If you see the first 3 lines, the last line you see, recovery of natural ecosystems in the following 20 years with net improvements by 2050. Can anybody in this hall tell me what is this net in biodiversity conservation and loss? What is net going to serve in this? Because biodiversity is mostly irreversible. Loss is irreversible. A species lost is a species lost. How can you offset the extinction of a species to somewhere else? Can you offset that? It's not possible. So why you are putting this term net into the text now? And this is part of the theory of change, depending on which has explained the global biodiversity framework, what they want to do. And then after that, you have very good lines, words, and paragraphs, which is an absolute positive for a good recipe of talking of gender equality, women's empowerment, gender responsive, right-based approach, intergenerational equity, everything, and talking of the rights of the IPLCs. So now if you go to the milestone A, again you'll find net gain in the area connectivity and integrity of natural systems of at least 5%. Again, you're using net gain. What is this net gain? It can only be a net gain if you kind of try biodiversity offset within the CBD parlance. And biodiversity offset means, as we say in climate, is that you continue to emit, but you are trying to say that we are reducing someone, balancing emission reduction and emission. So you mine somewhere, and then you fund for expansion of a protected area, and you say, okay, the biodiversity, what biodiversity has been lost is now being gained there. Is it a gain? There was biodiversity. You just expanded it and funded it and secured it as a protected area. So these concepts which are coming in are really concerning via the synergy issues. And that is why if you see the target 8, again, and I've said before, it starts with minimize the impact of climate change on biodiversity. Contribute to mitigation and adaptation through ecosystem-based approaches. And like the IPCC mitigation report, you have something like 10 gigatons of CO2 as a target for global mitigation efforts. What this has to go, can somebody explain, to halt biodiversity loss? And, because first of all, this is a recipe which in the negotiating tables we can repeatedly hear is being thought of or being changed to nature-based solutions, a recipe for nature-based solutions. And a lot of parties have said we are disappointed at this text because you should actually mention nature-based solution in the text instead of mitigation adaptation through ecosystem-based approach. Now the thing is that ecosystem approach is one of the pillars of CBD, and it has 12 principles. It has been, like discussed and the text decided for quite a long time. Now it's like 2009 or 2008, these principles came in. And the civil society, CBD Alliance, still believes that what CBD should follow is ecosystems approach. So this concern that by the synergy you are bringing in the climate parlance, the climate concepts, and so nature-based solutions, making it mitigation-centric, is not the right way to deal with the biodiversity loss or recovery of ecosystems. And if you see the target 21, we again have, it is for the rights of the IPLCs and also of women and girls, but there is a demand from the Women's Caucus within CBD and other civil society groups that we should have a separate gender target as target 22, which is still under consideration under the bracket in the text, but it's not there yet in that sense. So what is, now I'm going into the kind of the framework that Catalina was talking of 6.8 framework in Paris Agreement, if we see, because all that we are seeing is that what we see in UNFCCC as Article 6 and 6.2 and 6.4 market-based climate actions, almost some of it we are seeing percolating in the CBD draft GVF text in terms of linking to the market through net gain, net improvement, net loss, and the possibility of biodiversity offsets and nature-based solutions coming in. So if you see the 6.8 framework, it's a non-market approach. It has interlocking areas of mitigation, adaptation, so joint mitigation, adaptation, both rights and ecosystem integrity. We find them all now, even within the CBD, text and system. Activities focused on resilience, part of the ecosystems approach when you say, and community resilience. The LCIP platform, so IPLCs in CBD are well entrenched within the system itself and considered as a very important constituency. And recognizing tenure and collective rights of LCIPs, gender justice, and intergenerational equity. The text is clear now, the negotiating text, that they are also in favor of that. So we find some kind of synergy within the two to see that how we can perhaps adopt, and this is the first time that we are trying to share our thoughts and try to collect the thoughts that perhaps bring in a non-market approach to see that the synergy doesn't go the market way, to prevent it from again going to the market way and based on market heavily, try to bring down to an approach which we have in 6.8, and we could have it within the CBD actions. If not non-market approach, we can say an approach to real solution, real synergy. And so what we have is that the discourse around the draft GVF at this point of time, now talking of net, talking of opening up of opportunities for biodiversity offsets, nature-based solutions versus ecosystems approach, a fortress conservation model, which is reflected again in target 3, climate mitigation centric, reflected in target 8. We have strong right-based LCIP participation with FPIC, strong gender constituency, demanding a separate gender target. We also have the discourse on corporate capture in CBD also, very strong reflection on corporate capture, and perverse incentives at drivers of biodiversity loss. And this is target 18 of the CBD, and even in the last Aichi series of targets, you had the target of achieving, reforming, eliminating, phasing out of perverse incentives towards biodiversity loss. And this is still there, and this is a very strong discourse around this. And I feel that even in terms of UNFCCC and climate discourse, offsets should be regarded as perverse incentives. And here also I find the kind of synergies. So kind of reflection to end with, what we are not going to, should not allow now for the second time in the structure in the CBD and in what is going on in the CBD is that nature is commodity-driven, market-based approach to biodiversity conservation. We should not see undermining of the ecosystems approach in the name of nature-based solutions, not addressing real drivers of forest and biodiversity loss. Private sector, corporate-driven dependency. And so what we can take away as synergy and to see that in both the cases, in terms of climate and biodiversity, we could achieve real action through an approach which has in common non-market approach to mitigation and adaptation, including ecosystems approach. We can do that in both the systems. The core elements of 6.8 framework with a strong right-based, gender-responsive and equity pathway can counter the market-driven approach and find the synergy and pathway to real solutions to the climate change and biodiversity loss. And I put a question in it because still we need much more thoughts to go into it and also share it with the CBD Alliance, the civil society groups in CBD, that perhaps these are the ways where we can really use both the climate, civil society climate network, their support, and the CBD Alliance to come together to see in both the systems we fight what we don't want, the market-driven, corporate-dependent approach to climate actions, which will never be real climate actions. If you want to see real zero in climate, halt to biodiversity loss within the CBD parlance, find real solutions. We need to have a very strong discourse and action along the last 2 points that I have tried to share with you as kind of commonality between the two approaches. Thank you.
Thanks, Souparna. And thanks everyone for staying in the time allocated. So I would like to open the floor for questions actually at this point. So as I said at the beginning, the idea is to have like a very informal exchange. So please feel free to jump in with questions or comments or just reflections. As we said, we will also welcome ideas on some of these provocations. So I have a couple of questions for you, but I would like to wait for the public. Yes. And if you could introduce yourself before, thank you.
Thank you very much, and very nice presentations. Some very nice ideas. But I'd like to dig a little bit into the ideas on the LULUCF accounting and understand a little bit better, because it seems that you're suggesting we toss out projected baselines and that we go with sort of a carbon potential of an ecosystem as the baseline. And so the question I would have is, what does that mean for human activities in forests, forest-dependent peoples and shifting cultivation, things like that? If you're going to go with a baseline that sort of is based upon purely ecological carbon potential, then human activities sort of get dinged each time that you're going to account for, particularly subsistence level things that, if you're going to look at protected natural areas and things like that, the indigenous areas have lower carbon loss than other places, but they don't have zero carbon loss compared to completely protected natural areas. So that's one question. The second one is you want to throw out the managed land proxy and account for fluxes on all managed and non-managed lands, and you want to account for gross fluxes and not net fluxes. So again, that comes back to the indigenous people's issue. So what happens with shifting cultivation, where people are cutting down the forest for a few years, growing their crops, and then allowing fallows to regenerate? You sort of lose that if you move away from net accounting. But even more so, if you start accounting for areas outside of managed lands, you have a massive sink. right? The biosphere is taking up, I guess it's 11 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year globally, and most of this is on the non-managed lands. So if you start netting this out, the 6 tons that's emitted on the managed lands gets swamped by the signal that's coming off of the non-managed lands. So then what happens with that? If you're accounting for gross fluxes and you're not really looking at net fluxes and restricting it to managed lands.
I haven't made myself clear enough. I'm not suggesting replacing what we've got. I'm suggesting adding a really important missing piece of information. And the purpose of the SEA is not to do carbon trading. It's to see the value as an ecosystem account and put it on the books. It's not about, it's not, the fact that you can see all this stuff is one question. What is it that you actually account for in your target is something else. And so this is when I say this is a missing piece in we don't understand the quality and the condition and the threats to ecosystem carbon stocks. If you're going to make management interventions in landscapes, you need to have this information, not just the net fluxes. If you don't see the condition of your ecosystems and what the potential is for recovery and under what actions, then you've got a very weak information system, and that's what we've currently got. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you do need some new bathwater. It's an information system that will inform management choices. It doesn't mean you don't look at annual fluxes. It doesn't mean, I suspect you certainly need at least 2 baselines to really understand what your management choices are. If you've got a current baseline based on current management activity, fine, so long as it's not artificially inflated, which is what many of the forest baselines have been. They've projected on a upward trend based on sometimes very high past emissions that have then dropped, but they've kept the baseline quite high. There's all sorts of, ways of developing baselines that build in hot air. So, there are those issues that would ideally be separately fixed through the UNFCCC process itself. Bringing in the UNCEA as a tool is not a replacement to the structures you've already got. So
But
I think I have been...
about happen in the voluntary market, not in the...
It's not in a market at all. It's not in a market.
But there are no baselines in national greenhouse gas inventory.
There are in LULUCF. There are baselines.
Not in national greenhouse gas
Yes,
inventory, right?
but there's no indication of condition.
I
So
agree.
the
Yeah,
inventory
fully.
doesn't cover doesn't deal with the issue of integrity and risk, which are really fundamental moving forward, which the SEA does. And that's an important new tool. It's not necessarily, we could sit down and ideally revise and improve all the existing frameworks.
Yeah.
But I'm not actually suggesting that. I'm suggesting we bring in the SEA as an additional tool.
Right, but then what does that do I'm starting to monopolize the conversation.
Yeah,
here,
that's
but
okay.
What does
No,
that do with it within the global stocktake?
It
Because the
means
global
you've got...
stocktake is to assess what countries achieve with respect to greenhouse gas accumulation in the atmosphere with respect to adaptation, funding, and things like that.
And you
right?
need to know what your current ecosystem stocks are and the condition they're in and the risk of future release. That's what it does for the stocktake. So it helps you define the most resilient, long-lived future actions to put in your NDCs. So you've actually got a much more powerful information base on which to build your NDCs, we have such limited understanding, in almost zero, I would say, understanding of the importance of ecosystem integrity for stable carbon storage. That's the information that this brings to the table. It's absolutely fundamental to a secure future. There's more carbon in ecosystems than there is in fossil fuels. You need to know what condition they're in and how vulnerable they are to loss. It's a fundamentally missing piece. It's filling a gap in this system. So Yes, I would love to sit down and you know, have a reform process for the current LULUCF rules, but that's not actually the proposal. The proposal is to add value in bringing in this new system. If there's a new information system, think of it like that, to better inform decision making. So it is comprehensive. It does include, you can have any number of baselines in the CEA, by the way, but the fundamental one is that natural condition, so that you can see the condition of your ecosystems, how far you are below natural, and what that means for the vulnerability of those carbon stocks and even the communities that might depend on them. So it's actually of benefit at many different levels of management decision. So I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear, that I'm not at this stage saying, much as I might like to, but that's not what I'm proposing.
Thank you for your question. Anyone else? Any comments or? Because, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Thanks a lot. Nice set of presentations and discussion. I'm Amy Duchel from FAO, and just one comment that was made at the beginning of the session about links between the conventions. There's been a series of events on the Nairobi Work Program, which focuses much more on adaptation, but I think bringing in a lot of the spirit of even what has been discussed here in a very practical, kind of action-oriented way of focusing on thematic areas, forests and grasslands, oceans, coastal ecosystems, and really making these links between the climate change adaptation side and biodiversity conservation. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, that's true. The work program is working or having a lot of focus on biodiversity issues as well, with of course, like an adaptation focus. So that's really valuable. Yeah, thanks for adding that. I don't see anyone else, so I might drop a question myself. Maybe Souparna.
Yes.
Because it was mentioned that Article 6.8 can also help link the work inside the convention with the action developed by the LCAP platform. And I was wondering if you could really maybe elaborate a little bit on that, because that's another important point that I think would be interesting to hear.
It's what we are proposing, actually. And we need to sit with the LCIP people. And we have just started exchanging views, but it was our proposition that what has gone into the work plan of the LCIP platform could also be integrated into the 6.8 work program activities, so that it is being directly owned by the LCIP communities in that sense. And so it is better, it's much better of implementing along with them those activities. And there could be activities to start with, like legislative and policy support for tenure rights, collective rights, community governance, which is very important. You cannot deliver anything. You cannot deliver climate finance, which they want actually, direct access to the communities, without the community being part of the governance system. And that is still not developed in large areas of the countries. So whereas we are talking of empowering them in terms of climate action, the policy and legislative support, though you can do along with it, some of the countries have, but the implementation is in a mess because nobody wants to do that. But the core element is that communities as part of governance. So the community, we call it in terms of community forest governance. And then only you can actually deliver these actions, including finance and as direct access, as part of the framework, to the communities. So I think some of these things have to be initiated through the LCIP platform, and then one can link to the how do you actually think of activities involving LCIPs in 6.8 framework, you know?
Great, thanks. And maybe Virginia, sorry for putting you in the spot again. But just wondering, because this new framework for accounting has been developed by dozens of countries, almost 90 countries or something. They're already implementing that.
Countries are already implementing it, including the US and lots of European countries, so into bringing that into their national accounts. And there's some further refinements in various working groups, including a forest working group that's underway right now. But it will become the new ecosystem accounting standard globally. And that's and so it's just that it's a logical new tool that can be used by, you know, in all sorts of different ways. Actually, you could. Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, you.
Thanks. Yeah. So. Yeah, I think it's interesting that the CBD so rapidly picked it up. Almost as soon as it was released, it went into their indicators. So, and I think that through the GST process in particular, and also it can be trialled, like you're proposing, I know your organisation's proposing a trial of the UNCEA through 6.8 to see how it does fit with Indigenous and local communities and how that adds value or not into that sort of scale of activities. It's the scale is designed to be national at the moment. It's because it's something to be adopted in national accounts. It will be hugely important in people's national accounts, and it makes common sense to be able to draw on that in deciding on, what are the optimum climate actions in land, forest and ecosystems, because it tells you a lot about how the risk associated with any particular action you might be proposing in land, forest and ecosystems. And that element of risk is very poorly understood, and those linkages to biodiversity, underpinning ecosystem integrity and stability, and therefore lowering risk, is poorly understood here. And that's what I guess the SEA enables people working in a forum like this to see. The important why differences in ecosystem condition or integrity matter, and what those links are to biodiversity that underpin it. So, yeah, I think it's a really important new tool that if 90 countries are already trying to implement it into their national accounts, it should be a relatively straightforward thing to incorporate into the consideration, of what needs to be looked at in the GST, and maybe as an ongoing resource for state parties when they're deciding on, particularly if they're putting quite a bit of emphasis in NDCs on climate action in land and forest. This really demonstrates the benefits of integrating that with biodiversity and doing, promoting ecological restoration or promoting better protection of what you've got. It puts a value on what you've got at the moment, which is completely unvalued. So, the lamentations from the World Bank and others about our failure to stem deforestation, yes, there are myriad of reasons why, including lack of recognition and support for Indigenous communities and people's rights. But another reason is it's not valued. It doesn't sit within any economic framework. This puts it there on every country's books. They understand and see the value of what they've got. That has a financial benefit to countries to do that, to put it in their balance sheet as an asset. That will transform the balance sheets of some countries. But it's not a trading thing. It's not something that, you know, it of itself doesn't lead to trading. There may be other mechanisms that lead to trading, but that doesn't. The sea is not set up as that. It's an information system. So.
Thanks, Virginia. I'll just check if anyone, yeah, I have 2 questions, 2 hands there, so.
Yes, thank you. My name is Daniel Plugge from the German Development Corporation, GIZ. And I have one comment or information and a question. And the information would be that we've just currently released a series of papers on the synergies between biodiversity and climate policy frameworks and their implementation. And it starts with the legal connections between or frameworks between UNCCC and CBD, and also summarizes the latest scientific findings of IPCC and IPBES. And then we also look into, and that might be of interest regarding the comment on the ecosystem approach and nature-based solution, we try to have a very neutral look at those two and see where are the differences and what does it mean. And then it goes further on with good governance mechanisms for national and local level implementation, as well as financing options. And that can be found at adaptationcommunity.net. That is the one thing, and we are also currently working and close to be finalized on a paper on synergies between the NB subs and the NAPs. That's under the Nairobi Work Program. And then I have one question regarding the use of forest products and the debt that would arise from it. And I think it's important to see that it is true if you clear cut and if you don't do anything else. But if you have sustainable forest management, then the cascading effect of the use of forest products, harvested forest products, which is accounted for under IPCC guidelines, then this definitely has a positive effect in replacing other products, such as, you know, concrete for houses or other things that you might think of.
Thanks for that information. That's very helpful, and we'll certainly have a look at your website. It would be helpful, I think, if wood pellets were classified as a wood product and the emissions then accounted in the consuming country. I think that would increase transparency enormously, and it's a missing piece, if you like, in the IPCC process, but should be relatively straightforward to reform, you would think. But it is when the volumes are so high now, and where the wood pellets are coming from are not always well managed forests, where it is the lowest value use. It's often the driver of logging, and with catastrophic, actually, climate and biodiversity implications. So I think it is really important to have a much better way than we've got now of tracking the emissions that are coming from wood-based bioenergy. And, you know, there are all sorts of options on the table. In an ideal world, you'd probably just account for it in the energy sector. Failing that, I think it is another gap that it's not considered a wood product in its own right with its own emission factor. As you know, all the other wood products do. They have, you know, paper's got a half-life of 3 years, and the others, you know, what are they now, 2015 or 25 or something? It's a while since I've caught up, they keep changing. But there's nothing for wood pellets, which is an instant emission. And you cannot guarantee, even in Europe, there's old-growth forests been cut, pelletised and burnt. And they are irrecoverable in any kind of decent time frame. And that's the, again in the IPCC chapter, Working Group 3, Chapter 7, that's a remarkable step forward for the IPCC to recognise that carbon-dense ecosystems are irrecoverable by 2050. They talk about the importance of protecting primary forests and other primary ecosystems. There are important firsts in Chapter 7 of Working Group 3. And what we're seeing globally, and the burgeoning demand for wood pellets is coming from all sorts of forests, some of which are, and some of course are illegal as well. So it's a huge problem. But if they were accounted for as a wood product, instant emission in the consuming country, that would send a better signal to this burgeoning market. It would rein it in and be a much more controlled practice than it is now.
Thanks for your question. I just saw one more hand somewhere. Yes, and I'm afraid we have to leave the room in 5 minutes. So we'll just take that question and then we'll bring this to a close. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I am Iyo I'm coming from Ethiopia, and my question is related to, I think climate change is affecting not only by extincting species, but shifting of species from suitable site to other area. In my country, for instance, coffee growers are affected by climate change. The productivity is lower. So how can we link this type of impact by climate change with loss and damage? That's my question. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you've raised a very interesting issue, and it's actually important for many things, not just agricultural, livelihoods, where production will need to shift. It's critical for biodiversity as well, and that's why really the best form of ecological restoration is through buffering and reconnecting existing natural areas to allow that natural transition to occur. Where we've got that in Australia, we've seen birds have moved. So even birds have moved as far south as Tasmania, which is a fairly long flight for little parrots. But it's fascinating how quickly some species move. Now, some of the plants won't be so nimble. And there are major connectivity conservation programs in Australia that are designed to both mitigate climate change and foster adaptation and ongoing sort of ecological, processes. But in the farming sector and agriculture, I don't have those answers. You may be better off talking to someone in the FAO who's already considering these issues. I know it's being considered in Australia with production needing, like the wine producers have moved south. But we can't go to Antarctica, so and I don't think New Zealand would take us all. But anyway, we're going to hit the limits to adaptation for all sorts of things. It's we're living in very uncertain times. But thank you it is a very important issue. So thank you.
No, but it's good to link it to loss and damage, as you said. But, it's also good to recollect that, you cannot, as she said, IPCC also says that your adaptation options are limited now, getting restricted more and more. And so what is happening to the community resilience? Because the community resilience always dependent on their wisdom and knowledge. Now, coffee, tea are certain crops which are basically cash crops, came from somewhere. Communities were never related in their knowledge system through these cash crops. And so when the part of resilience comes in, or adaptation, they cannot do anything to that. Rather, they have to depend on the agricultural scientist or crop scientist for an input. And here is the problem with the communities who are actually linked to this kind of cash crops and the crops which are not part of their kind of a territory. And that's where perhaps at this point of time have to depend on the scientists.
Oh, yes, but you raise a very important point with the linkage of ecosystem loss, species loss, glacier loss, like lots of ecosystem services losses that are irreversible and are not still very much in the discussions on loss and damage, but that will for sure have tremendous implications to the livelihoods and the lives of millions of people. So I think that that's a very important kind of work stream as well to really emphasize the importance of this better integrations as well, because it's currently not receiving a lot of attention. So thank you so much for your patience and for listening to us. I'll just bring this to a close now, and yeah, just big applause for the panelists. And have a nice rest of your day. And if you want to chat with them, we can take it outside so we can leave the room for the next side event. Thank you.